I'm the president of Nature Regina. I haven't said that for a while. I used to say that at the museum, but I know we've got a few new folks joining us. So I acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands known as Treaty 4 territory. These are the original lands of the Nakaway, Nahaya, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. I pay our respects to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place who welcome settlers to this land in a spirit of sharing and with the intent to build relationships. Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming. Our tonight's presentation is Dr. Branimir is going to be given by Dr. Branimir Gjetvaj. Branimir is a Saskatoon-based biologist and environmental photographer. With a background in environmental and agricultural research, Branimir's interests are in the impact of agricultural practices on the environment and exploring options to achieve a sustainable food future. He has a Master's of Sustainable Environmental Management degree and a PhD and Master of Science in Genetics. Please welcome Branimir.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for coming and joining us tonight for the presentation. I gave a short bio to Elaine. I just said a little bit extra. I didn't put in. I'm a photographer, environmental photographer, and I've been doing that for quite a few years. I try to combine my photography and effort in nature conservation. I had 2 books published on prairie conservation. It's a Great Sandhills, and the last one is The Islands of Grass with Trevor Harriet. So some of you know me as member of the board of Nature Saskatchewan. I was a president for a few years, and I was also president here in the Saskatoon Nature Society. Right now, my interests are quite a lot in the food security issues and interaction between agricultural production and nature conservation. I was born and raised in Croatia, and I think that the traditions and heritage of my culture greatly influenced my relationship with other people and environment interact with. So quite proud of that. So that's as an introduction, and I'm going to go into sharing my screen, and hopefully things will work. Yay, look at that. Okay, I will start. I hope you guys can see my screen with a big slide presentation there, and hope you can hear me well. Everything working okay?
Everything's working.
Yay. Okay. So once again, good evening, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation tonight. And I hope we'll have a lively discussion. Hvala što ste me pozvali da vam dam predavanje danas i nadam se da ćemo imati vrlo ugodan i produktivan razgovor. So at the beginning, I would like to ask if you guys can maybe fill a questionnaire just to see the interaction, to wake you up and be more interactive, to see that things are working or not. The question is pretty simple. Are you a member of Nature Regina or a guest? And the reason for that is just to kind of formulate beginning of my presentation and some of the discussion directions. So there's an option here. You can see, are you a member of Nature Regina? You have multiple choices, yes or no. If you're not a member or a guest, just click no. We will not kick you off from the presentation. How are we doing there?
We've got about 26 out of 28 people voted, 65 are members and 35 are not.
Oh, there are a few people who are not members. Well, welcome to the presentation, and I hope you'll get excited and interested. and then you'll try and become a member and support Nature Regina. So that's good. So here we go. Oh, I see that. Excellent, 67%. Wonderful. So for the introduction, just to talk a little bit about how we frame the progression of environmental thought that you see here on your screen. It's a human-nature relationship over time, kind of overview the progression of the thought and how we relate to nature and how we relate to conservation issues and how we approach conservation. At the beginning, when you think about 30, 40 years ago, we started with the species and wilderness protection. Protected areas were very important. And that was a focus of conservation programs on species, habitat, and wildlife ecology. That progressed a little bit more to be more inclusive. We work at the population biology, natural resource management, and the issues with the human impact on the environment was extinction of the species, and looking at what are the threats and what are the threatened species from human impacts, specifically through the habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, overexploitation, and so on. Those thoughts progressed maybe 10, 20 years ago into looking more wider approach, looking through ecosystems, where we look at the ecosystem services, economic value, and also looking at ecosystem function. In that sense, there's a lot of kind of thought, and we still see that today about the, in that part, nature for people. It was conversation about the nature's contribution to people. So the idea was that people who are not particularly interested in nature conservation will be more interested in, because they see the direct benefit from healthy and protected nature. Today, the last 10 years, we see a more broader impact, a more broader look, interaction with people and nature through working landscape conservation, so that interaction of humanity in harmony with nature, where we look not only environmental factors, but also we look at the social and social ecological system, interaction between humanity and the environment. There's also a lot of question about the adaptability to changes, how the natural system and how the human system can adapt to changes, because we see a larger and larger impact of human activities on the natural environment, and also human activities on the climate. So climate is becoming, and climate change is becoming more prevalent subject of conservation, of conversation. There is also a concept of resilience, and I'll mention it a little bit in my talk, to see how the systems, whether natural or human, can react to external factors, and how much it can adapt, how much it can change, and how much both natural and human system can withstand perturbation in the system and maybe achieve some kind of a steady state, that we don't go into another system that we cannot recover from. When I talk about the importance of why small steps are important, I will talk about conservation later on, but here in this part, what I want to focus on is when I look at the studies of the work of large and small conservation groups and how people, citizens, interact with conservation organizations. A few studies kind of showed that people really, that the large conservation organizations do not have as large impact or attraction to people who were thinking of looking for organization to express their values and maybe fight for the values that they share with the general population. So we see a lot of proliferation of smaller groups, maybe special interest groups, and groups that deal with specific issues that are relevant to their local conditions and to local society. And I would say that Nature Regina, I would consider Nature Regina a smaller, in quote, smaller group, which is specifically interested in working the issues that are of importance to citizens of Regina, but also citizens of the wider area. I'm not saying that the large conservation and environmental organizations are becoming less and less relevant. They're still relevant because they have access to the large source of funding, and they can be much more effective in fundraising, communication, publication, and so on, and also with the relationship with the governments, whereas the governments really does not want to deal with smaller group or individuals. They kind of tend to work with larger groups. So my message here, what it was, is I am a little bit kind of inquired about the programs that you do, and I'm quite impressed with the activities and the number of programs that you do in terms of education, in terms of conservation. So I really applaud you, and I would like to encourage you to continue and really fight for it. Do not feel kind of disadvantaged being a small group. That is how the things are happening these days. So what you should try to do is continue with the programs and try to develop partnerships and network with the similar groups with your area, and also with the groups across Saskatchewan that share your interests and values. For example, this year we might have a more extensive program with Arbor Day. So this is a good opportunity for Nature Regina to get involved. Also, I'll be talking about nature-based solutions for climate change to deal with the effect of climate change and deal with the effect of biodiversity loss. And I heard that you guys have a quite extensive program and strong developing program for planting prairie strips, which is pretty cool. And applaud you. And that's one of the programs that you really can champion and move forward. So that was a very long introduction. And let's start with the main talk. So what are the challenges that we face today? It's basically everything can be focused on the three major themes. That's a climate emergency, and we hear a lot about that these days. How the human activities are changing the climate that we are facing, and larger changes in the climatic conditions due to mostly human activities and emissions of greenhouse gases. We also see quite painfully pandemic or zoonotic diseases that we see viral infections that are global in scale and quite destructive in how they impacted everyday life and everybody on the planet. There's also loss of biological diversity, where we see a large decrease in the number of species and also number of individuals on the planet. So all of these three events that we have, challenges that we have dealt with, what do they have in common? They have in common land use. We know for the climate change and climate emergency, it is the energy, greenhouse gas emissions, but also the land use change, right? It is how we change the land and how we use the land. With zoonotic diseases, it is believed that several of these viral diseases like SARS viruses, they switched from their original animal host into human population because of that increased interaction that was brought by intrusion of humans through foresting, agricultural use, development of settlements into the native habitat. And there is an interaction with the wildlife. They were natural carrier for viruses, that viruses to jump to humans. And then again, it is due to increase and inappropriate land use. With the loss of biological diversity, we know the habitat loss is one of the major reasons of loss of biological diversity and loss of species. When we talk about our interaction with the Earth systems and how we interact with everything on the planet, with the planet that we live on, in a group of scientists from Stockholm-based Resilience Institute, they introduced the concept of planetary boundaries and safe operating space for humanity. So those planetary boundaries are intended to represent Earth system processes, which, if pushed over a certain limit, could generate unacceptable system changes. So if you can see from the illustration, we have overstepped 4 out of 8 safe planetary boundaries. That's a biodiversity loss, which is impacted mostly by the land use change. That is nitrogen overload. So this is biogeochemical flows, nitrogen and phosphorus, land system change, and climate change. So when you look at that zone of uncertainty and beyond zone of uncertainty, that is a kind of gray zone that is a buffer. It's actually represent the potential threshold in the danger zone that will allow society to react on time on the early warning signs and prevent abrupt or risky changes. When we see here, when we think about beyond zone of uncertainty, what does that mean is if we move those planetary boundaries beyond uncertainty, we really do not know whether that boundary, that system will be able to recover and return to the previous state, or it'll go into completely new state that we have no idea what is going to happen. Most of these large, sorry, I should have stepped here, 4 out of 8 safe planetary boundaries with biosphere integrity, land system change, phosphorus and nitrogen load, and climate change are to the large extent that agriculture has a large role in all 4 those stressors. So this is why I'm going to talk a little bit more about the agriculture today, in addition to biodiversity conservation. So when we talk about climate change, first, humans started adding fossil carbon dioxide to the atmosphere about 300 years ago, and accelerated land use based emissions by converting forest into cropland and pasture to produce food. So the unintended consequences of these activities is anthropogenic increase in atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases, which is now changing our climate and greatly impacted. In 2019, there's a special report on climate change and land by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that report warned that we have to fundamentally change how we manage the land, produce and consume food, and substantially reduce food in order to minimize the effect of climate change. When we look at the level of emissions, although many people typically attribute greenhouse emissions to energy production, there are also other important contributing activities such as transportation and agriculture. The agriculture, forestry, and other land uses sector was responsible for about 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. If you look more inclusively, global food system could be responsible even up to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions if we include packaging, food waste, and so on. So when you look at Saskatchewan and Canada, some of the data, they'll tell you the agriculture is, and land uses, agriculture is responsible to 8 to 9%. But those estimates do not include the production of inorganic fertilizers, that do not include land use changes. If you incorporate all of those factors, that agriculture is responsible to up to a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, which is quite a large, has a quite large impact. So when we look at what are the effects of climate change and how does it impact Canada, increases in greenhouse gas emissions have been linked to raising temperature. And in 2019, the Canada's Change in Climate Report, commissioned by the Environment Climate Change Canada, paints a rather bleak picture. It reveals that since 1948, Canada's annual average temperature of the land has warmed by 1.7 degrees Celsius, and that Canada, on average, experienced warming at twice the rate as the rest of the world, which is pretty scary. And large part of that climate change and heating effect was experienced in the Canadian Arctic, in the north, on the prairies, and in northern British Columbia. In northern Canada, the annual average temperatures had increased by 2.3%, almost 3 times the global average. Along with these temperature increases, the ECC report reveals Canada experienced increase in precipitation, that extreme fire events will become more frequent and more violent, and will experience increased risk of coastal flooding. So more intense rainfall, the rainfall will be more intense in a shorter period of time, will increase the urban flood risk. What you see here is flooding in Maple Creek after a week of intense rains in June of 2010. The warming will also intensify the severity of heat waves and contribute to greater risk of drought and fire. So the cost of these extreme weather events to the society are on the rise. From 1983 to 2008, the cost of catastrophic insurable events annually ranged from 250 million to 500 million. Since 2009, so just 10 years ago, in 8 out of 9 years, the costs have ballooned up to 1 billion or more a year, with a 1.8 billion on average. That is reported by the SASPLAT and Natural Hazard Risk Assessment. So the floods and climate change events are more violent, and they are costing us more money. So how do we deal with that? The focus of climate mitigation is definitely to reduce the energy, transportation, and agriculture sector greenhouse gas emissions. That will require massive decarbonization through reduce of emission and also deployment of low carbon technologies between now and the goal is 2050, when our federal government is kind of planning, hoping that Canada will be zero neutral. So our success depends on the rising anthropogenic carbon sinks, and by transitioning world agriculture from a major carbon source, which is red in this graph here, and to become a major carbon sink by the second half of the century. We need to increase sinks from bioenergy and other forms of carbon capture and storage, engineering, and land use, presented here in blue. And also we have to have sustained biosphere carbon sinks to stabilize global temperature. What you see on the graph here is the green represent a natural carbon sinks, which will shrink as emissions decrease. So when you look at the graph here, so by 2020, human carbon emissions, predominantly by fossil fuels and industry, and a little bit by land use and land use change, hope is that those emissions would increase, And then we will increase the land use and removal through land use and land use change. And there will be also some engineering carbon dioxide sinks through technologies. And in green, that we will increase that biosphere carbon sink through increased restoration of natural systems. I'll talk a little bit later about nature-based climate solutions. So what are the possible approaches to terrestrial carbon capture and sequestration? So there's forestry practices to avoid conversion of forest land and other uses or deforestation. Then we have to include conversion of non-forest land to forested, and that was afforestation or reforestation. We have to improve forest management practices to either increase carbon stocks or increase net removal of carbon from the atmosphere. We can also maintain healthy and biodiverse grasslands, especially with maintaining and restoring perennial grasslands, particularly native non-cultivated area. Those areas capture and store a large amount of carbon below ground where it is relatively stable. This has an important implication for our climate mitigation efforts. So when you think historically, the conversion of native ecosystems to managed land, agricultural cropland, has been a large net source of CO2 escape to the atmosphere with significant depletion of carbon stocks. So the change in soil organic carbon, we see here in the graph that cultivation of previously untilled soils result in an average decrease in the soil organic carbon of 30%. And it changes whether we look at the prairie region in a brown soil zone, that decrease, the loss of carbon is slightly less than we see it in parkland region, where the soil has a higher content of organic carbon. And I think they also increased the vegetation, so the aspen parkland, aspen and bluffs. And the reason why the conversion is so dramatic is that when you look at the little picture, the native grasslands, they have much deeper root system compared to the cropland. In this case, I think it's wheat or some kind of grain crop. And you see the ratio of the root system in native grasses, which are much better in storing carbon in underground shoots and also in the rhizome. So that's basically one of the main issues that we have here, that maintenance of native grasslands or native vegetation, it's predominant. It should be our protection of natural habitat should be our priority. Then the management, what we have, and in last resort is to restore what has been lost, which is a quite important thing to do, considering how much change we did to the environment. I included this picture here, and I circled that I managed to find really interesting. The sign that is says caution livestock grazing. It was in Aspen Parkland. However, when you look at in the background, that land is not being kept and managed as a mixed grazing with Aspen Parkland. It's completely denuded for natural vegetation and turned into cropland. So if you, I don't know, I haven't had a chance to listen to the budget released this afternoon. Hopefully there'll be a lot of talk about nature-based solutions for climate change, because they are gaining prominence as an important approach to mitigate the effect of climate change, and also as a dual purpose to protect biodiversity. In February of 2020, just before the pandemic shutdown, I was fortunate to attend the Nature-Based Solutions for Climate Change Summit in Ottawa. There's a huge amount of interest. There were over 400 participants that the organizers did not expect so much, and they had to change the value several times to accommodate large interest. So basically, natural climate solutions. So there are, in 2017, 2018, there are two major scientific studies. Researchers associated with the US Nature Conservancy determined that globally, natural climate solutions could provide up to 30% of cost-effective CO2 mitigation up to 2030. You have to know that this is the best case scenario. Most nature-based climate solutions, if effectively implemented, also offer cost benefit like water filtration, flood buffering, soil health, biodiversity habitat protection, and enhanced climate resilience. You can see on the graph a different contribution of various biomes to the nature climate solutions. A similar study relevant to Canadian conditions will be released soon, hopefully this year, and will be published in Science Advances. It was submitted last year, but we're still waiting for the results. So we will know more. It'll be kind of interesting to see how it compares to the conditions in the US, where they have more, for example, mangrove forest, but we have a lot of peatlands in the Arctic around Hudson Bay and other areas. So there will be some differences in the conditions and advantages of using nature-based solutions for climate change and biodiversity protection. So what are the obstacles in climate change mitigation and biodiversity protection? I'll focus this section on agricultural production and the environment. If you remember from the beginning of my presentation, agriculture has a large impact on our systems, both in terms of climate change and biodiversity protection. Agriculture considered to be the single largest driver of environmental change, and at the same time, it's also the most impacted by those changes. And if you ask any farmer, they'll tell you how much uncertainty in weather conditions impact their business and livelihood. So through its impact on land cover change, agriculture is the leading cause of biodiversity loss. And this pressure can increase even further with a cropland expansion and intensification. We talk about the resilience. So the ability of the high input, low diversity farming systems, predominant with the monocultures, they have a lower ability to withstand disturbances caused by climate change, and their ability to recover could be diminished if we contribute with a business as usual. There is a growing understanding between the links between diversity and ecosystem function and services, and also resilience of the system to disturbance. Improving diversity, both on the farm level and also on the landscape level, would greatly contribute to food system stability and climate risk reduction. So simplification of the agricultural landscape through agriculture intensification could have serious impact on our ability to withstand climate change. So since European settlement in 1800s, it's estimated approximately 20 million hectares of wetlands in Canada have been drained for agricultural purposes. And the total loss of the settled areas is approximately 70% of historical levels. Ducks Unlimited Canada estimate that 250,000 hectares of wetlands have been lost in southern Saskatchewan between 1950 and 2010. And there's also estimate that 11 hectares of wetlands continue to be lost every day. There's quite a strong colonizing extractive mindset where everything becomes a resource and we have to use the land to extract resources, and that colonizing and pioneering mindset is still in effect in large part of prairie provinces, which impact how we interact with the land. In the past, farmers work around the wetlands. However, today, a drive for greater efficiency and higher yields, regardless of the environmental cost, and combined with the use of massive equipment, have led to farmers draining the wetlands at a high rate. The other natural features, such as shelter belts, have also been removed from agricultural landscape and an increased rate. So when you look how the agriculture is, or intensive agriculture is impacting the natural environments, we really have to rethink conventional high input agriculture. Why? Because formerly heterogeneous landscapes are becoming more uniform, with large areas of annual crops dominating over the greatly reduced and fragmented natural habitats of wetlands, woodlots, and native grasslands. The current model of high input intensive production of agricultural commodities rank high in provisioning services, meaning we get a lot in the crop yields, but they provide only low level of regulating, supporting, or cultural services. For example, soil loss, water filtration, water retention, soil biodiversity, and so on. So the agricultural intensification led to simplification of landscape structure, large loss of biodiversity, and potential reduction in system resilience, which is very important and critical with ever-increasing changes due to climate change. What is important to know and understand that a lot of loss of biodiversity is starting to threaten provisioning of ecosystem function, not only the services. So how the system actually is able to work and how is he able to respond to the changes, and that will ultimately impact food security and agricultural sustainability. So we are really kind of pushing the system to the end. There are two different models that I want to show you the approaches. How do you deal with agricultural production? So since the Green Revolution, over the last 70 years, we have witnessed the increased crop production with ever more sophisticated seed technologies, a better variety, highly mechanized farming methods that employ far fewer workers. Those new technologies have contributed to farm productivity growth, which has in turn allowed North American farm output to rise without significant growth in the economic index of agriculture input use. What I want to mention here that the input is when you see it's relatively stable over the years, includes also total production input, which is labor, machinery, and use of pesticides and fertilizer. When we see the input, the increase of the food products, that had the impact of reduce food cost, which led to increased obesity and also increase in food waste. So not necessarily that we have a large amount of cheaper foods does not necessarily mean that we're eating healthier food and we're leading a healthier lives. When I said that total agriculture input, labor decrease, labor effort, because of the increased use of mechanical, we have higher, better technology, bigger machines, more effective machines, then we can do the farming. But in the effort to increase and maintain crop yields, agriculture has rapidly intensified over the last 6 decades and relied heavily on agrochemicals, fertilizers, insecticides, fungicides, and so on. So when you look at the data here, just to briefly detail, just to see the changes over the years in the use of from top to bottom, much stronger colors basically show you the increase in the fertilizer use, insecticide, fungicides, and herbicides. So on the prairies, fertilizers are applied on 78% of and herbicides of 81% of cropland areas. There was a dramatic increase in use of fungicides, over 40%, and insecticide, over 50%, between 1996 and 2016, the years that those study was done. So we did see that although the global input remained stable, the labor input is lower, but the increase in agriculture chemicals has increased over the years. In comparison, a different model. So the North American approach contrasts sharply with the Northern European strategy, Northwest Europe, which emphasize using less land and other inputs in order to protect the environment. Nevertheless, by achieving a comparable rate of agricultural productivity growth, Northern Europe has been able to maintain its level of total farm output over the last 3 decades. So the EU began setting aside farmland to curb overproduction and maintain higher prices and maintain profitability to farmers. And they focused their programs heavily on environmental quality. So they require, since 2013, they require farmers to allocate 5% of their land to protected ecological focus areas. The goal is to generate long-term environmental benefits by prioritizing nature. So that program supports both production and conservation. As if you look at the graph, they managed to reduce the inputs, both in labor and chemical use, and maintaining the output of food that is sufficient to feed the European population. So I want to mention here, quite often there is a kind of scare tactics by politicians and unfortunately some academics to kind of try to scare that environmentalists are fighting to destroy agriculture. They're fighting against modern agriculture. I wouldn't call conventional or industrial agriculture modern. Not much then would have agroecological practices and agroecology-based agriculture as modern. So that nomenclature and naming the conventional agriculture as a modern is just misnomer, and I would ignore it because of the motivation of people who try to spread fear. I do believe that technology is very important. Application of technology, it will provide necessary and sustainable increase in production per unit area. What I have a problem is with the current food policies, which encourage farmers to produce as much food as possible against the lowest cost in a global food market with low prices. That does not, this policy and food system that we have now does not fully incorporate the environmental cost and social cost of food production systems that are being practiced. As I said, together with the environmental cost, there is a social cost as well. You see here just a graph over the last, whatever is that, 80, 90 years, that in the blue, there's a net general revenue. And then in the basically, the cost of agricultural production is in the blue, and the basically the cost of agricultural inputs is increasing. Basically, as a net effect is that the net farm income in the high input and high output agricultural production is really not bringing increased income for agricultural producers. They do they sell more product, they get more money. However, there are cost of their inputs is increasing even more. So their net income is stable or in some periods even negative. So there is a social cost to this high input, high output agriculture production. We do need to transform local and global food system. We need to increase food production, but without expanding agricultural land. And we simultaneously need to reduce growth and demand for agricultural products. Because, as I mentioned, the agricultural production could limit, the food system could limit our ability to reach the 1.5 or 2 degree temperature increase goal. If we continue business as usual, we will surpass that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal for the climate mitigation. And however, if we do approach this problem with the multiple ways and multiple approaches, if we increase the amount of plant-rich diets and maybe reduce the amount of meat that we have on the diets, if we have focus on healthy calories, more diverse food, and shy away from kind of calorie-rich, sugar-rich diets, if we increase the yield, sustainably increase the yields per unit area, drastically reduce waste, we might be able to accomplish that goal. If you just use 50% of those measures, we have a 67% of chance to reach that 1.5 degree Celsius limit to limit the increase in temperature rise. If we continue with the business as usual, we have no chance of reaching that goal of stabilizing temperature increase. So by focusing more attention on species and functional diversity of ecosystems in agricultural landscapes, through enhancing on-farm scale diversity, we might be able to design and manage agricultural landscapes for better delivery of biodiversity-based ecosystem services. So how we can accomplish that? Through application of agricultural practices that will increase stability of the system. It will help us reduce the amount of chemical inputs. And also, as I mentioned, that will improve farm profitability and security for farmers. So if we increase diversity above ground and below ground of biological communities, we can increase resource use efficiency and stability of ecosystem production over time. So there are many studies that show that diversification of agricultural production will enhance biodiversity, pollination, pest control, nutrient cycling, soil fertility, and water regulation without compromising the crop yield. So this is something that we think of to increase diversity in our own farm and outside of the farm production systems. We can have many benefits without impacting the yield. And why is that important? Oh, sorry, I did not show you that one there. I missed it a little bit. So what is the example of non-crop diversification? One example is the prairie strips that you're probably very familiar with, because they serve as a refuge for pollinators and pest controlling insects. If we look at the bee abundance, there are studies that show that they decline with decreasing non-arable land cover. So if you don't have natural areas around agricultural fields, there will be decrease in bee species abundance and diversity. Another thing that's important to mention that is up to 40% of pollination is done by insects other than bees. And that's why it's important to maintain natural features in agricultural landscapes. to provide refuge for those beneficial insects. Why is that important? Because pollinators improve production of 70% of 124 major world food crops. I will not show you the video because that'll take us a little bit of time, but that is basically, there was a new program, Agricultural Climate Solutions, that the federal government implemented, and funding started of April of this year, April 1st. And basically what they're trying to do, they're seeking input from agriculture producers, environmental non-government organizations in kind of designing and designing research that would help us improve sustainability of food production and food security. And why is that important is that actually the federal government is trying to bridge that gap between environmental component and agricultural component of our system, which unfortunately, when we look at the provincial level, kind of environment and agriculture ministries do not talk much to each other. So hopefully, I have a big hopes for those programs to see what's going to happen. So we'll go a little bit more about the biodiversity here. We talk about the biosphere integrity, and we talk about the functional integrity. So in 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that's organization parallel to IPCC, released a major report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. The report warned that the nature and biosphere integrity are declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, with negative impacts on people around the world. The report stressed that we need to fundamentally change how we interact with the natural environment. The report also mentioned that over 1 million species are facing risk of extinction. As a graph that I found from a different paper showed the decline of North American birds regarding the different biomes. And you can see here that the grassland birds decline quite dramatically since the study started in 1970s. So there's a huge reduction in birds, one example. And when we look at globally, that the report stated that nature is a vital contribution to people, and it is deteriorating worldwide. In Canada, Wildlife Fund, I would just point to this report that was released in 2020, where the World Wildlife Report documents that populations of all assessed species in Canada generally stay the same level. However, there's a drastic decline in species considered to be at risk or of conservation concern. When I talk about the species loss, there's more and more studies happening now to look at the ecosystem function and the link between biodiversity, showing that having higher biodiversity, we have a stronger, more resilient, and more multifunctional systems. However, there is a global erosion of that global functional diversity, which was impacted by that biodiversity decline. So not only that the species diversity is declining and we are losing ecosystem services, but also ecosystem function is greatly threatened. So if you heard about a global deal for nature, the idea that to increase the global protected areas and targets for the Convention of Biodiversity from 70% of Earth land by 2020, which I think Canada just barely reached, and the goal to increase to 30% by 2030, and the ultimate target of 50% of protected area by 2050. So how that can be accomplished? There's one proposed framework, propose a baseline of 3 broad land use conditions, where we combine protected areas within the cities and farms on shared land through working landscapes, and large wild areas where the protected areas would have quite a large component. Just a little bit of primer on protected areas and other effective conservation measures. You're probably aware of those protected areas like national park, wilderness park, and so on. But there's also other different types of protected areas which have basically designed to protect biodiversity and wildlife over the long term with in situ conservation of biodiversity and associated ecosystem function and services. So we have strict protected areas and other protected areas that are incorporated into that protected area system. There's more and more research going on how to combine the creation of protected areas to incorporate nature-based systems to mitigate climate change and also to protect biodiversity, right? There's a growing recognition to integrate those climate and biodiversity policy targets and agenda into area-based conservation plans. Similar to the global, there's also studies done on the North American scale in Canada. This is just one example, the mapping of areas to protect biodiversity and also to mitigate climate change by protecting and restoring peatlands, forests, and grasslands, to enable carbon sequestration and storage, and at the same time, protect biodiversity. So to protect and expanded protected area networks, we have to have a climate change in mind, and how we can accomplish, similar to biodiversity, increase in size of the existing reserve, we have to increase the number, and we have to increase the connectivity within the landscape, especially human-dominated landscape. And that is an important component that we'll talk a little bit later about the idea of working landscapes. So I'm getting pretty close to the end. So on the biodiversity side of the ledger, large protected areas that are managed for the long-term conservation of nature, they're still a cornerstone of biodiversity conservation. They provide suitable space for the species that are susceptible to disturbance or habitat fragmentation. Like here you have a picture from the Grasslands National Park. Nevertheless, species populations within and outside of protected areas continue to decline. Even large parks, like a Grasslands National Park, they will continue to lose species over the long term if they're isolated from one another by unsuitable habitat. For example, many migratory species use a habitat that are outside protected areas for a large part of their life cycle. Focusing our conservation effort on large protected areas conservation strategy alone will not be sufficient without including conservation efforts to protect surrounding small and often isolated habitat patches. So conservation of small areas is increasingly being considered as an important element of conservation and restoration of natural areas. For example, you guys, what you're working on restoring a prairie strip is a very important component of creating more uniform and more stable protected area network. And that work is particularly important in heavily modified human-dominated landscape, such as we see here on the prairies in predominance of agricultural land. So for biodiversity conservation, the effectiveness of protected areas is significantly influenced by the type of land management on surrounding land, right? So a complex matrix of wildlife-friendly landscapes or working landscapes will complement protected areas by providing necessary habitat for some species while facilitating dispersal and adaptation to climate change for others. Efforts to increase heterogeneity and diversity of agricultural landscapes where land use and management practices complement biodiversity goals of protected areas, in addition to provision of goods or services, should be an important component of biodiversity conservation strategies. I'll show you here a quote for one of the studies that was done in Alberta when they looked at the biodiversity within protected areas, and they found the link between the strength and health of protected biodiversity within protected areas to the diversity in the surrounding landscape. So diversity in surrounding landscapes, even in prairie, this is specifically for prairies, were highly influenced by how much diversity we have in surrounding landscapes. So natural human worlds cannot be separated into conserved area, into well-defined protected areas, and leave the rest of the earth for humans to play and work on. So in similar way, expanding protected areas into the most productive areas for food production, like grassland and wetland ecosystems, could require displacing agricultural production to less protected regions, where more land would be required to meet existing demand for food production. So what is the possible solution? Is basically a shifting effort how much protected area we have in a certain landscapes. For example, if we have cities and farms here with people, we will have fewer protected areas and more kind of shared lands where humans can interact with the natural landscape. Whereas in protected areas, in indigenous, conserved, and protected areas, we will be able to include more and large wilderness areas. So that shift, the idea how much land we can protect has to be flexible to so be able to accomplish our biodiversity goals, but also food security goals, right? You cannot have one without another. So there are ways to run the agriculture with the nature inclusive agriculture production to provide for food security and provide for biodiversity protection. One example of the environmentally friendly farming, or some people call it wildlife friendly farming, would be shelter belts for Canadian prairies. There are many ecological services. There are many ecological services provided by the shelter belts, besides providing habitat for wildlife. And also there are studies showing that the yield also increases in the vicinity of the shelter belts. So again, protect biodiversity and provide for food security. There are goals and calls to recover and restore at least 20% of native habitat within working landscapes to accomplish the goals both of food security and agriculture and biodiversity protection. So how do we sustainably produce food and protect wild nature? If we want to move agriculture from its current role as the world's single largest driver of environmental change, we need a paradigm shift, a new system thinking in which the sustainability of food production, maintenance of ecosystem function, mitigation of climate change, and protection of biodiversity must present a core strategy for land use planning and agriculture development. We need to consider designing agricultural landscape as a mosaic of land uses comprising of agroecology-based farmland and farming production, wildlife-friendly working landscapes, and protected areas at various spatial scale. Working landscapes, as I mentioned, need at least 20% of retained native habitat. Maintaining and enhancing biodiversity with the agricultural system may reduce the trade-off between food production and ecosystem health, and also increase ecosystem resilience in the face of global environmental change. So protected areas are clearly defined geographical spaces that are dedicated and managed to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. In coming years, we had to focus our attention to establish more indigenous protected and conservation areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, where lands are managed in ways to secure conservation of biodiversity, and also where applicable cultural, spiritual, and socioeconomic values are being conserved for future generations. What can we as individuals do? We can spend more time in nature, bird watching, preferably with your kids, watching bird watching, looking at rare plants, and learning about the environment. We should learn from, interact with like-minded individuals, including members of the farming communities. As a society, we should try to increase networking and build partnership with other organizations and individuals. We should be society engaged and proactive citizens, because only when the wider interest in the subject, nature conservation, created in the minds of the majority of the citizens, we will be able to accomplish the goals of nature and biodiversity conservation. So don't be afraid to speak out, let your voice be heard, speak to your political representatives, either local, provincial level, express your concern and express your desires, how our landscape you want them to be managed. We might not be able to tell people what to think, but we might be successful in telling people what to think about. If we work on defending our relationship with nature, we should be able to define what the problem with the environment is, I said problem in quotes, who is responsible, and what course of action needs to be taken. So with that, I will finish my presentation, and I would like to ask if you guys have any questions. Anybody awake there? Hello, hello.
And if you want to ask your question in the chat, I can read it out for Branimir.
Questions? No questions. Are you guys still asleep? Hello, wake up, wake up.
Hi, it's Linda. Can you hear me?
Sure, Linda, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I'm wondering if you could put those websites and those references that you showed into our website. And are you going to put these slides into an upcoming book or present it to the Saskatchewan politicians? Where do you go from here?
Well, go from here is, yes, definitely present to politicians, but what I would like to do is, yeah, I'm working on a paper maybe to have this topic. I have several presentations to put something, the article with this topic for a Blue Jay, Nature Saskatchewan Blue Jay. There'll be more references. I kind of put it on paper, but I think the presentation has been recorded and it will be available on the website, so you can have a look at it again. The references, some people put just a name and a year, but I try to put also the paper, so it's easier for you to find the reference and what I was talking to. So this is that there are two possible solutions to your question, answers. One is look at the recording and pause it when the reference comes. And another one is, yes, I do plan to kind of write a more popular article for the Blue Jay. So hopefully it'll come up sometime this year. So the reason why I'm giving this presentation is to get a feedback from the people. What do they think about this idea? Because it is there is dichotomy between conservation groups and conservation-minded people and agriculture producers, that protected areas should be on one side with the exclusion of everything else, and agriculture would be on the opposite end, where we don't need nature. We can focus on increasing production. And if there's a little bit of loss in environmental conditions, well, that is all for the good cause, because in quotes, we need to feed the world. But that's another topic that I thought of presenting, but at last minute I cut it out because presentation would be too long. So I cut it out. If you have a question, I do have a comment about that. But that's basically Ingrid. Okay, yes, we'll talk to Ingrid. I just want to say, this is what I wanted to show, is to start thinking that we really messed up our natural system and our agriculture to the extent that we have to do something to combine nature conservation and agriculture production, because we are hurting both systems. Ingrid.
So I have two things I wanted you to talk about, like the things that I think about constantly that are totally out of control. First of all, the growth model, and it really doesn't, of economics. The growth model of economics just says we have to make more and more money, and we have to produce more and more food, and we have to, everything's more and more material goods, and the earth can't sustain continued growth in that sense of growth of population, growth of material goods, and pulling all of that energy out of the soil and so forth. With, you know, there's no conservation, there's no balance. So how do you deal with these massive issues? I mean, I know we can talk to people locally, but you know, I always get overwhelmed by those two things. It's not just capitalism either, because capitalism certainly focuses on the growth model, but heavily. But I mean, if you look at Russia and China, you know, that are purportedly not capitalist, they're still working on the growth model.
Well, yeah, when you think about China too, it is a special form of capitalism anyway. So it's not much different from, let's say, free market economy capitalism and control capitalism that you see in China, right? So that idea of growth, that is the only solution. You mentioned that the idea of sustainable or maybe steady state economics, where we actually do not need growth to sustain the population. There are a lot of ideas, a lot of thinkers, economists, sustainability academics who do talk about not need to have this continuous growth, which is basically going to push us against the wall. When I show those, the reason why I show those two examples of approach, North American approach and European approach, is that we could, especially in a European context, we could produce sufficient amount of food without putting more pressure on the environment. And we can also focus, we should be focusing on healthy food rather than kind of just empty calories, sugary-based calories in food, cheap food that is not nutritional food. So that is one system that we have to raise awareness. We have to kind of talk more about it. And that, if my belief is that we have politicians, but we do not have leaders. It is unfortunate that we rarely have a leader that would leave the society to benefit the society. Most of them are interested in basically first few years to have really high hopes for building a better world, but at the end, they just want to stay in the power, right? So politicians will do what their electorate asks them to do. And that way, if we do push for the change, if we have engaged citizens, politicians will follow.
Our next question here is from Darlene Clifford, and she asks, have you spoken with the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation?
No, I have not spoken with the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation. That is a possibility. When we talk about this agricultural climate solutions program that Environment and Climate Change Canada, National Resource Canada, and Agriculture Agri-Food Canada programs, they did have quite a wide kind of discussion of workshops where they tried to get feedback from various stakeholders. And I think the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation was one of them. So this is one of the possibilities for discussion to go forward. And I definitely plan to work with Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation and similar organizations. The reason why I put, maybe I'm associated right now with a few conservation education organizations, but on the title slide, I put that I'm associated with Prairie Food System Vision Network. This is a group that we started just a year ago, less than a year ago, where we try to work with at least now 30 organizations and individuals, try to reform a food system on the prairies, where we work to improve the social justice, food security, and also environmental quality incorporate into the food system on the prairie. So this is more kind of inclusive approach that we will try to really combine and work with many groups, whether they're conservation, education, social justice groups, towards a common goal, providing and creating a just and sustainable food system.
Thank you. Our next question is from Paul, and they ask 20% protected habitat. We are definitely skewed in Regina or screwed in the Regina Plains. I think the prairie is much harder to bring back than a forest.
Yeah, good point. And that's why I show you that graph when it shows that 20% is flexible, right? In Regina Plain, it is a highly productive land. And if we have that land that is used for a food production, we should continue to use that for the food production and improve that nature inclusive agriculture through agroecological practices with, let's say, increases the amount of shelter belt, increase the amount of prairie strip, so recovering and restoring some of the natural features of the landscape that will provide a little bit of assistance to nature and also provide assistance to the agriculture and farming communities to be less dependent on chemical inputs. So that 20% of protected habitat, maybe it's not achievable on the Regina Plain, but we should try to maybe get 12% or 14% that is not going to be this pristine protected area, but it will be nature and wildlife friendly area that also counts towards that protected area, right? It does not need to be strict protected area, but we are so messed up that we need to do something. And that includes developing border areas around the agricultural fields, includes creating corridors, maybe along the natural habitat along the rivers, natural habitat along the highways, and especially natural habitat within cities, because it's a heavily populated area with Regina, right? So even nature-friendly landscapes in the cities are very important. So we should be working towards that as well. And when you say that the prairie is much harder to bring than the forest, you're completely right. And that's why I said the priority is to protect what we have, manage it properly, and then restore what has been lost. And it's much more difficult to restore native prairie that has been lost compared to maybe aspen parkland, which actually parkland itself is built and developed throughout history, according to very frequent disturbance, especially fire disturbance. So let's say aspen parkland will be recovered much quicker than native prairie habitat. So there's a little bit different there.
Thank you again. Great answers. Our next question comes from Anna, and she asks what your view is on the ideas of degrowth.
Yeah, I don't want to comment too much of that. That's again, it's the idea of that steady state economy where we basically, it's a circular where we, in terms of growth, is at a steady state. We do not increase production or increase, let's say, GDP index. The question the way how we measure GDP and how do we measure that growth, it's really very limited. We should also include in our development index the quality of life, the health, not just economic output. So that's one of the measures that we should include in our assessment of quote growth. So when you say degrowth, maybe degrowth in economic output sense, but increase in, let's say, quality of the life, the social structure, the strength of the social structure, the strength of the health services, education, and so on, which could and should increase, right? So when you talk about a degrowth, a lot of people think about maybe degrowth of economic development or economic output, but growth in that quality of life index that we should try to improve. Was that a really good political answer? I'm training to be a politician, so I can really muddle my answer really well. How am I doing there?
I think it was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Our next question is, how do we educate farmers about biodiversity and farming a different way? Where do we start?
Farmers are a really interesting bunch. They are very averse on change, and they're very afraid of change. And there is a good reason for it, because their livelihood is really on the margin because of those very narrow profit margins. Their livelihood is at stake because very small mistake can really make a big impact in their success. There is also the threat of climate change and basically climate conditions. Again, very small changes in climate condition, drought, temperature, moisture level could really be make a decision whether they make it one year to another. So they're very averse to making changes if they're not feeling comfortable about it, right? That fear of change is really ingrained, and it's quite understandable. So there are farmers and they're members of farming community who are capable of or able and interested in experimenting, slowly experimenting to try something new, incorporate regenerative agriculture practices, incorporating agroecological practices, whether there's like a diverse cropping systems, whether they work cover crops, where they don't leave land open, large part exposed, large part of the year, which is a little bit trickier in Saskatchewan climate conditions and moisture conditions. farmers who really try to restore the shelter belts, put more of that kind of agroforestry system when you incorporate trees with agricultural production, farmers to try to incorporate livestock production with the crop production to both increase their economic resilience, but also increase their stability of their system. Because again, there are a lot of advantages of having livestock on your cropland. So how do we educate farmers about the biodiversity? Farmers will learn. If they're interested in, they will find and they will learn on their own, because if they see members of their own community are succeeding in the work what they do, if they incorporate, let's say, regenerative practices, and they make more money and their income is more stable and their farmland is healthier. So, and they will learn and will try to pick up. So I would not go about educating farmers about biodiversity and farming in a different way. I would support farmers who already incorporate those practices in their production. A few years ago, I listened to the representative of World Wildlife Fund. They're working, it's a US Wildlife Fund. They're really interested in incorporating the concept of food security and food production in conservation. So what they do, the idea is support the best and the rest is follow. So that's what I think we should be doing. There are groups, for example, Farmers for Climate Change. They're really interested in working on the systems that will mitigate the climate change. I found one group in Britain, Nature, I think they're called Nature Friendly Farming. So another group that might be a little bit more, there's not much interest. I even kind of inquired at national farmers unions, what would be the feedback on that? Not as much, because that idea is not kind of ingrained. There's interest, but it's not ingrained. There are farmers, they're involved in the ALUS program, Alternative Land Use Strategies. They incorporate a lot of what I mentioned here, recovering, restoring nature, using regenerative farmer practices. So that is a group that we should support. As a consumer, what you could do is support farmers who produce food in a sustainable way and buy their products. Support them by giving them money by buying the product. And that will be direct support for them, and they will see that there are consumers, because consumer preference will have more and more impact on the way how we arrange and how we practice our farming. So that's something that you can do to support that, in quote, education of farmers about biodiversity and farming in a different way. So, because a lot of time you will hear, don't tell me what to do, I know the best, right? It's really interesting that that mentality is there. Farmers know the best. Nobody should tell them what to do. It's really kind of a learn it's like in a relationship, in a marriage, right? If you convince your partner to do the things that they believe, they make their own decision, they would really be more willing to do that, right? Rather than telling them, oh, you have to do this. If you help them to make their own decision, and if that decision is really in line with what you want to do, you'll be more effective. Same with farmers. They're guys after all, most of the time.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Lisa, and they ask, there has been quite a lot of research and feedback from the cattle farming industry on carbon sinking and how cattle farming and eating meat is not an issue for environmental concern. Have you looked at this body of information, and what is your reaction?
Okay, I do not have a definite answer. Depends really, everything depends on your assumption. First of all, when we look at I know the studies that they look at how does the management, rangeland management impact carbon sequestration, right? There are clear studies that show that more kind of beneficial ranching with cattle farming. So ranching management improved biodiversity. That is a relatively clear result. Whether you really do intensive farming or do more diversity farming, when you do a rotation in your cattle management, that has a very direct impact on biodiversity level. The level of farming practices on carbon sequestration is more muddled because there are a lot of different elements in there, the soil structure, moisture, grassland community that you manage. So there's no clear result yet to show the particular type of ranching management is beneficial, more beneficial or less beneficial. In terms of, let's say, intensive farming practices, feedlots, and maybe extensive ranching where you basically have your cattle or grass-fed beef, it is, in terms of economic and calorie output, in terms of maybe impact on climate change, I would say for what I saw, there's a slight benefit to having finished, like a feedlot finished beef. The reason for it is that you actually reduce amount of time of the cattle on the land, so you bring it to the market sooner. That way you reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, especially methane, from cattle production. However, having more extensive cattle operation, when you have cattle longer on the pasture, improves biodiversity, improves the food density of the meat that you receive, improve the health of the quality of the meat that you receive. So it's not a clear answer what is better, one or the other, right? So again, a politician answer, it depends.
I believe Gail said that she would vote for you.
Oh, okay, great, thanks.
And our next question is from Bruce, and they ask, how do we start to get ourselves out of this mess? Is it mainly through education of producers and the general public, or is it through AG policy changes?
Okay, I see, Ingrid, are you waving or you're just fixing your screen there? Okay, after I answer that question, we'll maybe go to you. How do we start to get ourselves out of the mess? Is it mainly education of producers, general public, or through the agriculture policy changes? I would say all of the above. In my introduction, I don't know if you heard, I have a PhD and master's degree in genetics. And I decided to do another degree in sustainable environmental management. The reason for that is that I realized I'm learning more and more about less and less. And I was worried that I will learn everything, know everything about nothing. So my degree in sustainable environmental management, I took courses in environmental economics, environmental law, social studies, decision-making. I took one course in decision-making because I realized that we know a lot. We do have a vast knowledge. There's a question, how do we apply that knowledge and how do we make decisions? And that's that agriculture policy changes. Depending on the government, we will have more progressive or less progressive policies, but those policies too, they come up to kind of envision to the politicians, because they hear what their voters are interested in. They do know from scientists recommend, but every politician will look and make decisions looking at various sources. They will not only listen to the scientists and the best scientific advice, they would also look what their electorate want. So when you said what the electorate wants, then we go into this education of producers and general public, right? So it has to be a multi-pronged approach. We have to do all of the above, and not just one or the other.
And sorry, Ingrid, did you want to say something?
I put it in the chat. I was just fiddling around looking
Oh
at
yeah, okay,
who was next on the chat, that's all.
okay,
So if other people are ahead of me, I don't want to push in.
okay.
Okay, perfect. So we do have two-part question before yours. So it's coming from Paul, and they ask, there was a recent study of biodiversity on English hedgerows. I have been wondering since how our hedgerows would compare. So I looked at many hedgerows in Saskatchewan and cannot believe that the same amount of biodiversity would be found here, especially that they are all imported species and were not present historically. An Arizona example, last spring/summer, there was at least one large devastating fire in the Tucson suburbs in the natural areas of the mountain. A Zoom talk I attended indicated that a widely planted imported grass was responsible for spreading the fire. I guess, do you have something to comment on that?
Okay, yeah, I'll talk first about a recent study of biodiversity in English hedgerows and perception that there's a higher biodiversity levels in hedgerows in Europe compared to hedgerows in Saskatchewan, if I got that right. Maybe there are various reasons for that. Is in general, when you think about the climate conditions in Britain compared to Saskatchewan, right? You have more moisture, more the plant life and plant ecosystems. It's more productive. There's a more ecological niches in hedgerows in Britain that we have here, which gives the possibility, opportunity to have higher biodiverse system in hedgerows in Britain compared to Saskatchewan. I do remember, like, I was born in Croatia, and I know that forests in Croatia are much more diverse than our forests that we see here in Saskatchewan. And I think there's various reasons, historic, because in Europe, you have way more diverse habitats on a smaller area, and you can have kind of influx of different species from surrounding area. Here on the prairies, we have huge areas of relatively uniform habitat, climate, and vegetation systems. So that ability to have more diverse hedgerows is diminished. So that, I think that is the reason why we see more biodiversity in those hedgerows in Britain than we see it here. And then the second part of the question, where we have Arizona example, devastating fire. A Zoom talk attendant indicated that a widely planted imported grass was responsible for spreading the fire. I don't know. I mean, that could be just a coincidence. Maybe it really depends how that grassland was managed, what was the fire load. Without knowing that, I really do not know how to answer that, because there is a possibility that widely planted imported grass is case that you have more uniform grasslands. Think about, for example, native prairie and a field seeded with crested wheat, right? In native prairie, it'll be wet, it'll be greener through a longer period of time, whereas crested wheat, more uniform species introduced and planted species will be green at the beginning and will dry out sooner. Now, if the fire happened in that period, for example, when you have the crested wheat when it was drier, maybe the fire load was higher compared to native grasses, they'll be not as dry in July and August as the field of planted crested wheat. So maybe that is a possibility of increased fire load and increased chance of fire. This is just my speculation, not knowing exactly the system, what happened there. When we talk about the fire and systems, one thing that I really would like to point out here is talk about the importance of different habitat for sequestering carbon. There are a lot of stories about that the forests are more productive and maybe more desirable to plant trees. Sorry, to plant trees than to sequester carbon than maybe plant grasslands. The question here is, there's a study in California that they look at actually what was the release of carbon into the atmosphere following the fire, where you have this treed landscape. The trees were caught more on fire and released way more carbon in the atmosphere after the fire compared to grasslands, which majority of the carbon was sequestered underground and protected from the fire. So in terms of what better system, plant trees or plant grasses, is to mitigate climate, again, it depends. If you don't have fire, if you don't have unstable system, maybe forest planting trees is better. But if you live in very diverse, I'm getting tired here. If you get very diverse and very flexible system, unpredictable system, maybe having grasslands as a carbon storage on the prairie system would be more beneficial.
Awesome. Thank you again. Great answer. And we can't tell you're getting tired. I feel like you're doing a great job. Thank you.
I'm losing. Oh, we are getting close.
Yep. One last question here, and it's from Ingrid. And she asks, organic farming would enhance biodiversity. Buffer zones be good for pollinators. Apparently, they only reduce production by 11%. Are there some demonstration farms?
Okay, there is a slightly different number here. I think I will challenge your statements here. So organic farming in general does enhance biodiversity for various reasons, because they're more diverse. Organic farmers usually do not have large areas of monocrop crops planted on their field. They're more diverse systems. The farms are usually smaller, so that allows for that border areas around cropland to increase habitat for wildlife. Buffer zones are good for pollinators. That is true. As I said in my presentation, if you have larger fields with less border habitat, then the ratio of border habitat to the field itself, that is detrimental for pollinators. And then buffer zones are good for pollinators. So probably Ingrid is talking about the prairie strips. Now, there is a demonstration farm, I think it was in Iowa, where they looked quite a long-term, several decades study in prairie strips. And they use prairie strips to both kind of manage the water for water management, reduce erosion, increase pollinators. So they look at the productivity. And I think what to remember here at 11% was in the farm field, they could have up to 10 to 11%, sometimes 15% of those prairie strips without reduction of yield.
Oh.
But those prairie strips actually increase those ecosystem services that I mentioned, water filtration, water management, soil erosion, and so on, right? So if you have up to what you said, 11% of prairie strips, you increase ecosystem services without decreasing the crop yield. So the question now for farmers, they don't have any direct benefit from it because they don't make more money. They maybe make more money if they grow pollinator-dependent crop. They will get pollination, they'll get more productivity, more fertilization, so they will increase their productivity and income will be higher. Otherwise, if they grow wheat, for example, having pollinator strip really doesn't improve their productivity and profitability much, except with water control, right? So how do we encourage farmers to have up to 11% of prairie strips? It has to be some kind of government incentives to encourage farmers to have that. So if they can make a little bit more money with having a prairie strip and not losing income, but losing yield, they will really accept that management practice.
What about the lower expense? Like they're not spending as much on chemicals, right? Because the chemicals are so expensive.
That is true. Again, there's a one factor that if you have, for example, a prairie strip, they would contain natural predators to insects, maybe pest insects, then you might be able to reduce the amount of pesticides that you need to use, right? So there will be reduction in input cost. And then that is one of the factors, the positive factors, why a lot of regenerative farmers actually switching to that system, because they might have slightly reduced yield, but they have a greatly reduced input cost through chemicals and fertilizers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that was our last question for the evening.
Oh yeah, can I just say there are some demonstration farms. I think now that the Agriculture Canada in Manitoba, in Borden, I think they are working on especially prairie strips and pollinators. And researchers here in Indian Head are working on border areas around farm fields. So they might have some demonstration sites there if you contact.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Branimir. It's a pleasure to have you speak with us this evening. And obviously there was lots of interest. So thank you very much for that. Just a couple of things we were going to have, we've uploaded a couple of posters regarding some up and coming Nature Regina events. One of them is the Earth Day event that's going on with a number of partners that Shannon's involved in, and the other is the City Nature Challenge that Kirsten on the board is involved in as well. So if you have a look at the website to see what's coming up with those, that's coming up soon, or actually is in the process very quickly. So I just wanted to remind everyone that next month we'll have a regular membership meeting on Monday, May the 17th. So please join us for a presentation about the David Suzuki Butterfly Way project. It's a volunteer-led movement growing highways of habitat for bees and butterflies across Canada. So several of Nature Regina's members have been selected by the David Suzuki Foundation to be butterfly rangers, and the rangers help make their communities greener and healthier, one fun planting project and community at a time. So this is a perfect way actually to get involved with what can you specifically do about climate change. So if you want to come out or to our talk next month, hear how you can get involved in your own yard. We are going to have our annual general meeting on May the 31st. And we're going to do that by Zoom. So last time we did everything by mail out. This year we will be doing, you'll get your packages ahead of time by email or Canada Post, but we will actually be conducting the meeting online and doing the voting online as well. So that's about it for me. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out. And thank you again, Branimir. It was great to have you. Good night.